Okay, so welcome everyone to our Centre for Autism monthly talk for May, where we're absolutely delighted to welcome Nic King. She's going to be talking to us about young autistic people and the importance of self-understanding. As always, the plan for this evening is pretty much the same as it has been for previous talks. If you've joined us before, if you haven't, then I'm going to introduce you to the Wellbeing Hub team. I'm also going to do just a little bit of housekeeping about what to expect for tonight, and also tell you a little bit about the University of Reading Centre for Autism Wellbeing Hub. And then I'm going to hand over to Nic, and she's going to talk for approximately 45 minutes or so, and that leaves us with about half an hour for questions at the end. So in terms of the Wellbeing Hub, as I said, I'm Jo Billington, and along with my colleagues Fiona, Hazel and Emma, who are probably all waving on screen now, we all run this project that we refer to as the Wellbeing Hub. If you need to contact us for any reason at all, then our email address is autism@reading.ac.uk, and Hazel will respond to you, or one of us will respond to you if Hazel isn't available. In terms of information about tonight, a recording of tonight's talk will be sent to you all within about 2 weeks. We just need to do a little bit of editing of the talk, tidy it up a little bit, put it onto our Vimeo website, and then we will send you the link. So we need a couple of weeks to do that. Nic's slides for tonight are not going to be shared. So the recording is going to be there, but we won't be sending you a copy of her slides. If you would like to pose a question to Nic, please do so using the Q&A feature. The chat is open tonight, and we've had some really lovely and lively chats at our previous talk. So if you feel like you want to add your comments, or if you just want to share things that you're inspired to share because of the things that Nic's talking about, then please feel free to do that. But if you have a question, just to make sure that we can definitely ask Nic that question, put it in the Q&A, and then at the end of Nic's talk, I'm going to collate those questions, and depending on how many we get, because sometimes we can be really, there could be hundreds of questions. What I do is I tend to kind of collate those into kind of broad themes. So apologies in advance if your specific question isn't asked to Nic, or unfortunately, if we just have such a volume of questions that we don't get round to yours. I do apologise in advance for that, but I'll do my best to put as many of your questions to Nic as possible. In terms of the Wellbeing Hub, for those of you who might not know, this is a project that we've set up in the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at the University of Reading. And essentially it was set up because we were really aware of the fact that we know a lot about autistic distress. We know a lot about the challenges that autistic people face throughout their lives. But when we look at the research literature, particularly, to find out about autistic well-being and flourishing and thriving, particularly from the perspectives of autistic people themselves, we don't really find a lot. There isn't really a lot written about that. And that's problematic in lots of different ways, but mostly because the result of that is that what happens in terms of the support that's offered to autistic people when they are in distress is often based on what non-autistic people say they want, or indeed what works for non-autistic people, which, as we all know, doesn't always work for autistic people. So there's lots of reasons why this is an important topic for us to focus on. And what do we do? How can we make a difference? Well, the first thing that we do is we place autistic voices at the heart of absolutely everything that we do. And our main objective at the Wellbeing Hub is to build an inclusive community of autistic people and their allies, and bring some curiosity to this idea or this question of what is autistic thriving? What is autistic flourishing? And to build that community, we've done a number of things in our first year. We launched in November, and since then we've been running these online monthly talks, all on the theme, something related to autistic flourishing and thriving, delivered well, up to this point, entirely by autistic people, but we would also welcome talks from allies as well. We're also running termly in-person special interest groups for professionals who work with autistic people so that we can develop and communicate best practice in terms of neurodiversity affirming support. We also work in schools and with families, and also we are planning some direct work with autistic children and young people, maybe perhaps even along the lines of the things that Nic is going to be talking about tonight. And also, we are training the clinical professionals of the future, because through the Wellbeing Hub, we also provide placement opportunities for master's students who are enrolled in the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences here at the University of Reading. And everything we do is being documented in the hope that we can make a meaningful contribution to the research literature and try and kind of, flip that narrative from distress and challenge being, and obviously that research is really important, but trying to kind of make it more balanced so that we do have more literature out there around, actually what is autistic thriving and flourishing. So if you want to know more about what we're doing, because this is moving quite quickly, do sign up for our newsletter. I'm sure many of you already are, because you found out about the talk tonight. You can sign up again by emailing autism@reading.ac.uk. And before I hand over to Nic, I just want to do a quick plug for our next talk. Next month on the 13th of June, we have Elaine McGreevy, who will be talking to us. She's a speech language therapist, and she'll be talking to us about creating enabling communication environments for autistic children and young people. But tonight, we have the great honour of having Nic King join us. Nic is autistic and otherwise neurodivergent, and she also has a neurodivergent family. She is the director of Pandas Online and the creator of NeuroBears, a course for autistic young people, which is sold and licensed internationally. She's involved in various research, training and consultancy projects, and she passionately believes that through training and understanding, we can create ripples of knowledge that serve to improve the outcomes for neurodivergent people. So thank you very much, Nic. Very warm welcome to you, and over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now so that you can share yours.
Thanks. Let's have a look. Do we see a panda? Is that working? Fabulous.
It is indeed.
Okay, I'm Nic. And what we maybe missed from that why is that active? What we maybe missed from that introduction is that I really like pandas. Okay, so I'm the creator of NeuroBears, and I do work internationally as a trainer and a consultant and a researcher, and I am passionate that young people understand their autistic identity at a young age. And that they start to think about how they can create environments where they are happy and comfortable and safe. I've got a particular interest in sensory systems, in burnout and positive self-identity. I have a personal and expansive knowledge of the system, as it were, that families face, and I try and work within and without it to try and help the next generation and their families to have lives that work for them. My passions are pandas, in case you hadn't noticed. Cats, musical theatre, the outdoors. One of my friends was looking at my bio for this talk, and she said, you know what it should really say? One woman got sick of waiting for else to do it, so did it themselves. So tonight, Jo knows was going to go one of two ways. Because NeuroBears is through research, and it may have been pre-published for tonight, but it's not. So we're doing the question version of the talk rather than the answer version of the talk. So what I would like to create tonight for you is a bit of a reflective space, and I'm going to pose lots of questions, outside of which is your favourite potato, possibly more than I answer. I do honestly believe that as professionals and practitioners and parents, the only thing that we can really control is ourselves and how we are in the world. And when we know better, we can do better. And that, you know, we can create ripples of change. We can shine out glimmers into the world and hope other people are doing the same. Okay, so what does post-diagnosis support for autistic young people look like in the UK? It's like a visual. So we've got a diagnosis. That probably took a long time. There was probably lots of barriers to that. Might you feel alone in that process? Might you feel a bit lost in that process? When that process is finished, where can you get help? Where are you signposted to? You're often signposted to local groups, local support groups, charities, the voluntary sector, other autistic people who might be working for free or voluntarily, social media groups, maybe your local offer. Although I'm sure I read something on SNJ this week that said only 28% of them are compliant to the law. You might get a post-diagnosis pack, although they seem to be quite uncommon as well. I saw a post-diagnosis pack for one of our local hospitals, and it signposted you to a charity that closed 11 years ago. Within our system, children aren't necessarily told about their diagnosis. They are not guaranteed to be told. And the parents are often left with little or no support to do that process. So my first question, why are we diagnosing this generation of young people if we are not going to educate them on what it is to be autistic? How is it different to when I was young and I was undiagnosed? How is it different to when my parents, my uncle, my grandparents were not diagnosed? How are we changing the narrative right now? We're diagnosing record numbers of new people, and I am not against it. But how are we hoping to change things if we are not going to educate them about their community, about their identity, about their needs, and about their co-occurring conditions? What do we want for them? Personally, this is what I want. Neurobears is based on the 5 A's. And I want a generation of young people who have a fundamental understanding of these and their autistic identity. So we start with authenticity. So the feeling of being your genuine self, to be able to act in a way that feels comfortable and happy for you. An acceptance, a process where you feel validated as a person, that you know you're not just by yourself but by others. Agency and a feeling of control over your actions and their consequences. Autonomy and a state of being able to be self-directed, to be independent, to be free, to be able to act on your ideas, your wants. And advocacy. I want them to be able to speak for themselves and can communicate their needs, how they understand them. In Neurobears, we talk a lot about the golden equation with pandas and bears. Because we talk about how Panda needs to be in a bamboo forest. That's his natural environment. That's where he is happy and comfortable and safe. Where he's eating his bamboo. Do you know pandas eat brand-specific bamboo? They might just turn around one day and go off it. They need to climb trees. They also do handstands and wee up trees to mark their territory and communicate with other pandas. I like facts. Polar bears, if you look at them, you might assume that they're not good swimmers. They're actually marine mammals, and they're incredibly good swimmers, and they're incredibly good in the water. But when you see a half-ton fluffy thing walking around out land, they don't look like they can swim that well. If we think about polar bear creating an environment for Panda, what would that look like? Would that look like a rather large icy plain? Would that look like swimming for fish? How would Panda respond to that environment? What would happen if we didn't like Panda's response to that? Would we hold Panda accountable? Would we say that Panda needs to be more resilient to the cold? Does he need to do better? What if polar bear had the hierarchy in that relationship? What if polar bear got to make decisions about Panda's life and what Panda needed based on his own ideas and what he liked and what worked for him? And then if we didn't allow Panda to communicate what he needed, if we didn't give him the words to do that, what would that look like? It's why it's important that young people have safe spaces and safe adults to communicate and talk about being autistic. So we're not pushing our ideas onto them. This is some of my early feedback, and it says the course is open to eyes to possible co-occurring conditions, and that we're wanting to explore more. We still feel we're in the very early stages, but Pandas have really helped us open the discussion and given my young one things to start questioning and figuring out, because we're at the start of the journey. I still wouldn't feel confident that I had the correct terminology, as everyone seems to have their own code and their own words and phrases. And maybe there's something in that. Maybe there's something in that we still don't have the right codes and the right words and the right phrases or the right environments. So, do young autistic people feel safe to be their authentic selves? It really depends on who, it depends on where, it depends on what, and it depends on when. They tell us they do not feel safe at all times. This is not a common thing, and they do not always feel like they are around safe people, and that they can be themselves at all times. There are all sorts of narratives around masking and resilience and shame in really, really young children. I'm talking 8 to 10-year-olds, where you think they aren't conceptualizing these things. But if we ask them, and I have, they are. So what do we need? We need to think about sort of where they do tell us they feel safe. My feedback is that home is very much a place of safety, that is an environment where they normally feel safe to be autistic, where they can be themselves. There are some very, very difficult narratives around school and peers, and then intersectionalities within communities. So quite often groups of other autistic people or groups of shared interest can feel safe, but not necessarily the school environment. And the young people that do talk about school being a safe place isn't necessarily about the building. It's about there being a safe person there, a safe person that they can communicate with, a safe person that understands them within that environment. And there are some young people out there that are lucky enough to have those adults in their life. So when are we talking about being autistic? If we're not talking about it after diagnosis, if we're not having these conversations in our household, if we're not feeling like we have enough knowledge to share with our young people, if we are not feeling comfortable to do that, when do these conversations end up happening? Do they end up happening during diagnosis? Do they end up happening in the middle of a meltdown? Post shutdown? During some sort of crisis? Maybe a time where they're having attendance issues or social issues. And when we talk about them in those moments of dysregulation, in those moments of crisis, in those moments where it doesn't feel safe, where are we framing that young person within that moment? Are we framing them as the issue? Are we framing them as the problem in that situation? Are they being framed as something that they have to resolve themselves? What if we do talk about diagnosis? What if they go on and they think about diagnosis, or they hear in their diagnosis meeting, what voice are we giving them in that moment? There are so many policies and acts in law, locally, internationally, that state, you know, children should have a voice, that they should have a voice in their care, in their education, in their health. Article 12 says every child has the right to express their views and their feelings and their wishes in, you know, all matters affecting them, to be considered and taken seriously. But what words are we giving them about that? Are we talking about them as deficits? Are we talking about them as abnormal? Are we talking about them as failures, as reduced, as poorly integrated, as difficulties, as restrictive, as repetitive, as stereotyped and inflexible, abnormal, excessive, adverse, impaired, and disordered? If those are the words they're hearing, but then those words don't match their lived experience, those words aren't matching what they're feeling and they're experiencing, what kind of communication tools does that leave them with? If we only observe autistic young people as a sort of a series of deficits, and we don't just observe them, we observe them and then we write it down, which is a very specific thing, particularly for the young autistic community, how can they have an authentic voice if those words don't match what they think about themselves? And I would hope they don't. What words are we giving them? Now, quite big words, especially for a dyslexic. Neurobears has never ever shied away from the big words. I have always been of the opinion that if a young person can tell me about a very specific dinosaur from a particular, like, Cretaceous period, they can understand the words biodiversity. I've regularly had children tell me about dinosaurs that I can't even begin to understand or spell. So the words that we give them within Neurobears, we talk about autism as neurology, we talk about biodiversity, we talk about neurodiversity, we talk about neurodivergence, and most of them even know the difference between that. We talk about the social model of disability. We talk about proprioception and vestibular and interoception systems, and overwhelms and meltdowns and shutdowns, and monotropism and stimming. And yes, there is a glossary. But you know, it's important that they have these words. It's important that they have a place of shared understanding, of shared communication, because what they do is they identify with it and they take it in themselves. And even our youngest users, who are a lot nearer 8, have no issues with these words. It's something that we observe and we put onto young people and assume they won't understand. But it's often about not understanding ourselves. So when you do that, what do you get out of it? We see the world differently, and we are unique. We can focus on things I like for a long time. I notice and hear things that other children don't, and I can be very focused on the things I like. That I'm hyper creative, that I'm quick thinking, that I'm curious and smart and funny, and I can live life to the fullest and be quirky and imaginative, and that they have a good memory and they can spot patterns well, and they're experiencing the world in a different way, and they are good with facts and details. When we start to think about the positivity in that. We start to think about our strengths. We start to move away from these ideas that we are a series of deficits or in some way broken, and that we have a lived identity, we have a lived culture that can be shared. And what's more, they start to tell us what they're good at because they are autistic, not to spite. They tell us that they're good at building, and they're good at music, and they're good at art and reading and words and maths and gaming, definitely gaming. And they associate that with their autistic identity. They associate their positives in their life with their autistic identity. Something that is extremely important to them, and actually this is one of my favourite feedbacks. They want to hear from the autistic community. They want to understand from us. And I really liked that it was made by autistic people, because there is nothing more annoying than getting talked at about autism by neurotypical people. I love that bit. I loved that it was made by and for autistic people. It meant everything to me that you could use the word we when talking about autism. And they also, in the last video on Neurobears, we share about us. We share like our needs and what we find that works for us. And I can't tell you how often they think they're alone, how often they think it's just them in their school, just them in their community. And we know it's not. We're just not enabling that knowledge within them to find their neurokin and their peers. Okay, so what else? What's important in other aspects of sort of self-identity? I call this the autism umbrella, because we all know that autistic adults have huge barriers to healthcare. Whether you want to frame that within, you know, the double empathy problem, the triple empathy problem, we know that autistic people are experiencing co-occurring conditions, and that has a very negative issues with our health and accessing healthcare. In Neurobears, a lot of the young people really appreciate. We talk about 15, we talk about ADHD and dyslexia and dysgraphia and dyspraxia and dyscalculia and OCD and PDA and anxiety and synesthesia, aphantasia, alexithymia. You know, if these young people, lots and lots of young people, and it's partly because of a postcode lottery and it's partly within that double empathy problem, are not going to get these co-occurring diagnoses. You actually can't get a dyslexia diagnosis in my area anymore. And it would go under, it's the autisms. It's not the autisms. So even if we can give them a space to start thinking about themselves, about, you know, thinking about potential co-occurring conditions, or even just why when their teacher is telling them to imagine something and draw it, that, you know, that word aphantasia might start to come into their head, because they actually don't know that some people can't visualize things because we haven't told them. Because observation doesn't really work. Polar bears aren't white. Polar bears are actually translucent and they reflect their environment, and that's one of the reasons there's a polar bear. You know, we can't even begin to sort of conceptualize, you know, ideas around how we perceive autistic young people. We can't begin to understand how much they're masking, how much they tell me they're masking from an incredibly young age. And they recognize it, they know they're doing it, but they also know that they're not safe enough to not do it. And then we're observing them and we're making decisions about what they feel and their behaviour and what might be going on, and putting ourselves in that space. We're definitely not asking them. And even if we were asking them, how do we frame ourselves within that, you know, double empathy problem? I can't tell you how many times I've had a young person where they're like, just tell us what you need, tell us what's wrong, tell us that you're not okay. Young people, even very young people, have already had years of validation before you even have that conversation with them. And they know. You know, we have to think about environmental factors, how difficult some places that they have no choice but to be in are for them, and how much accommodations, no matter how many, might not be right for them. How we have our own personal biases, our own personal heuristics, and just because we can't hear the electricity in the walls doesn't mean that they can't. What are we telling them? Are we telling them that, you know, you're not allowed to be your authentic self here? You have to fit in with the herd, you have to fit in with this classroom, you have to sort of in some way not meet your needs. You have to be like polar bear, even if, you know, you are a panda. We might occasionally get you some bamboo, if you're lucky, if funding allows. Maybe if you've got 10 points in the behaviour chart this week. Are we over all behaviour as communication? Can we be over that? What about all behaviour is open to interpretation? What if we're wrong? I often tell the story mainly because it's years and it still sits with me, of Jake Reisman, and he was a self-advocate on a virtual star summit in 2021, and he had a case of misunderstanding and this model of observation, and he came on, and when he was young, he was non-speaking, is non-verbal. He didn't have a good method of communication. He was given PECs, but it didn't really work for what he needed. And he told the story about when he was young, somebody had put on the Wiggles show. I don't know if you know what the Wiggles are. They're a very annoying Australian children's band. And he was watching it. And he was watching it intently, and he got excited, and his body started sort of like showing that, you know, maybe he might be enjoying himself, or that was at least how he was perceived to be feeling. So they started putting Wiggles on all the time. They started buying Wiggles merch. You know, the Wiggles became part of his life until he was 15, and he learned how to communicate using a spell to speak device. And one of the first things he wrote was F the Wiggles. Because people had assumed because he had a disconnect between sort of his apraxia and dyspraxia, that they had observed him being happy and excited, but he wasn't. He was frustrated. And that went on for years. And we observe autistic young people all the time. I can't even think of another section of communities where they are observed and it was written down so much. We write it down and we keep it for decades. What if you wrote down like your moments and kept it for decades? What if something that happened that you, I don't know, in hindsight was problematic, you felt bad about it? Do you want it written down for years? Do you want it put into an EHCP? Do you want it written in a letter to DLA? Do you want it in a professional letter that stays on your records forever? And what if we were wrong? What if we were wrong in that moment? What if, you know, we observed it and we were wrong, and it's there as a fact. It's there as a fact forever. Who are we serving by doing that? What are the consequences of doing that? What are the narratives around these young people that we are creating for them? And does it serve them? You know, does it serve reading that they have profound needs on an EHCP document of a very long list of things that they cannot do, potentially until they're 25. From 5 to 25. That's 2 decades. What if we perceive them to be fine? What's the consequence the other way around? What if we perceive them to be fine? I often talk about, there's a Facebook group called Not Fine in School. The last I checked, and it's probably gone up, they have 55,000 members. There's only 32,000 schools in the UK. What is fine? What does fine look like? What do we observe fine to be? Is fine even an accurate weather forecast? What if they're not fine? Have we asked them? Do we listen? Now, the other question I get a lot is, when is the right time to tell young people they're autistic, and how should I do it? And I think this is still, it's a huge thing. It's something that I still hear. There were even a number of people who withdrew from our research because they didn't want to tell their young people that they were autistic at that time. And I'm not saying it's wrong. It's a very personal thing. But I often think of the Einstein quote that if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Now that's fine. Not knowing how to explain something because you don't understand it well enough is very, very valid. Because we're left in this post-diagnosis chasm. Do you know what happens if you go and Google autism? So the first link you'll get says, autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability caused by differences in the brain. People with ASD often have problems with social communication and interaction and restrictive or repetitive behaviours or interests. People with ASD may also have different ways of learning, moving, or paying attention. How are you breaking that down for a child? You're not. And also, it's not what the autistic community would tell a young person about being autistic. We wouldn't talk about them being with, we wouldn't talk about them being disordered, we wouldn't talk about them being repetitive or restrictive. We would talk about it in a much more holistic and community and cultural basis. The next thing you've got is NAS, which is a little bit better, but still. What is autism? Autism is a lifelong developmental disability which affects how people communicate and interact with the world. More than 1 in 100 people are on the autism spectrum, and there are around 700,000 autistic adults and children in the UK. That stat is over 10 years old already. And we're wondering why children think they're alone. They think they're 1 in 700,000. They're not. Those percentages are so much higher now. But they are the first 2 things you would find if you Googled autism. There are other things that you can find. There are other things those young people can go find. They could go find the I Am Autism video from Autism Speaks. And I'm not going to actually play you it because it is genuinely distressing. But I do want you to think about the fact that young people could find that. That could be the first bit of information that they find. And I'm going to read you a tiny sort of abstract from it. And it talks about being invisible of your children. But if I can help it, I'm invisible until it's too late. I know where you live. And guess what? I live there too. I hover around all of you. I know no colour, no barrier, no religion, no morality, no currency. I speak your language fluently, and with every voice I take away, I acquire another language. I work quickly, I work faster than paediatric AIDS, cancer, and diabetes combined. And if you are happily married, I will make sure your marriage fails, your money will fall into my hands, and I will bankrupt you for my own self-gain. Could you imagine, as an autistic young person, that's the first thing you hear, a comparison to cancer and cures and ruining your parents' marriage. The conversations need to start. They need to start at home. They need to start with safe people. They need to start with safe places. And they need to come from within our community. They need to come from places of understanding and places of care. It's important. We know that diagnosis later in life is associated with poorer mental health outcomes, and we know that adults who understood they were autistic were told as children potentially have better mental health outcomes. We know that, you know, a significant portion of the autistic adults today were not diagnosed in childhood. We're often referred to as the lost generation. And in theory, you know, that might have different outcomes in terms of quality of life, of feelings of well-being. But the findings where, you know, adults were sort of empowered by their diagnosis when they were young. They had better outcomes. They had better mental health outcomes, and this feeling sort of control of your narrative and feeling empowered and feeling that you can create coping strategies at a young age, or at least sit and consider what might work for you, what might you need, what might your strengths be, what might your needs be. How can we identify that? How can we share that? How can we communicate that? Is that not the best place to start talking about adulthood? So if we're thinking of autistic culture, if we're thinking of autistic identity, if we are thinking about sharing what we know as autistic adults to autistic young people to try and help them have a positive sort of self-identity, have ways of having a language and ways to move forward with their lives. The UN has recently broadened sort of its ideas around like cultural rights to include things like art and language and access to sort of digital technology, and a broadening of ideas sort of around identity, you know, a right to culture. Do young autistic people have a right to autistic culture? Do they have a right to a positive self-identity? Do they have a right to not feel alone? Do they have the right to like being autistic? Do they have the right to communication, to technology that helps them to communicate, to words that help them communicate? Do they have the right to sort of feel safe in the environments that they are in, so they can help their creativity and they can think about ways that they can aspire and dream and have sort of agency and control over their lives? Is that tangible? Are we, you know, giving them access to that? Can they find each other? How can they find each other if they don't know that they're autistic? How can they have shared experience with other young autistic people if we're not telling them? How can they understand their identity within the systems we put them in? How do they know that they're a very valid panda? They're not a failed polar bear. Do they have the right to not feel alone? There are some of them who genuinely believe they're an island and that there is no we out there. Do they have the right to feel safe in environments? You know, how can we change that as adults for them? I know we talk about sort of agency and autonomy, but as young people, you simply don't have as much of that as a fact, just based on your age and not much more. How how can we as safe adults consider how we can be safe for them, how we can create safe environments of them, how we can listen to their concerns, their needs, their desires. How do we help them communicate that? How do we create and nurture a space that allows them to be their full authentic selves, allows them to have their identity? And when do we start to move away from that sort of that diagnosis model, that dehumanization, those negative aspects? When do we center away from that and into our sort of community and culture? Do autistic people have the right to well-being? And if they do, when does that start? Do they have that from birth? Do they have that from the point of diagnosis? Do they have that from the point of self-identity? How do we center them in their own existence? How do we create authenticity, acceptance, agency, autonomy? How do we build those foundations for them? How do we start that process? Personally, I start with bears. There we go, Joe. I'll take questions. I didn't look at the chat. Should I have looked at the chat?
Thanks so much, Nic. Absolutely lovely. Thank you very, very much. Just before we do go to questions, would you like to talk a little bit about your podcast with Kate Fox? Because I know that isn't something that I've put into the chat. It's a new thing that I wasn't aware of until we chatted earlier. I thought maybe this would be a nice time to plug it.
Fair. Okay, so I do have a podcast with the lovely Kate Fox, who is a fabulous autistic woman, radio regular, live poet, writer. She's awesome. And it's called Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. And it's it's definitely entertainment. There is a level of education to it. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to start centering how neurodivergent people often have lives that look quite different. Stand-up poet with a PhD in comedy is it's not the thing that you're, in fact we actually recorded that the other day, it's not the thing that your careers coach told you at 15, is it? It's just not. And it sort of the title and the rest of it came from the fact that I have children that are very heavily involved with circus, and there are no neurotypicals in the circus, and yeah, that's where it's from. So yeah, it's they're half an hour long. They are on all good podcast streaming services. We get lovely feedback from them. I enjoy filming them. You'll have an E rating, just saying. I did really well not to sweat, mate.
Thank you. Lots of love for the podcast on the chat. It's obviously one that lots of people are already familiar with, so thank you for that. Yeah, so again, just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A if you have one for Nic. I'm just going to scroll up because there was one that was in the chat which generated quite a few responses from the attendees tonight, and just wondered what your perspective might be, Nic. So this is somebody who said that they got their autism diagnosis 4 years ago at the age of 43. Their 12-year-old son is not diagnosed, but he's very like me, the person who's posted. So me and my husband think he might be autistic too, and we're trying to parent him accordingly. However, his school have not raised any concerns, and we know how difficult it is to get assessed, as waiting lists are so long. There's another issue in that I work at my son's school myself.
Yeah,
I got there, and they're not very understanding of my autism. So taking everything into account, we really don't know whether to get him assessed And our son doesn't know whether he wants to be assessed either. So do you have any thoughts on this, or perhaps any advice you might want to give?
Oh, if I had some pounds for every time a teacher who worked in a school who was ND, who had a child who was ND. This is not the first time I've heard this. And I think it's hard. I think it's hard when you are at work and your child is at work and you might not be safe at work to be your authentic self, and then we're talking about a tiny child being safe enough to be their authentic selves. I mean, I think if you have a neurodivergent household where you have a good understanding of your needs and what's going on, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough that, you know, you can keep reviewing that. Maybe in that situation you have a level of privilege where you might not have to do waiting lists, and you could consider private assessments that are fabulous and neurodivergent affirming, because there are plenty of people out there doing that now. Other than the fact that I hear you, I personally am big on go get an assessment, go get on the waiting list, go wait on the waiting list. And school's opinion definitely isn't everything. I along with, because we know polar bears aren't white and the observational model doesn't work. But I do think that then that other factor where you are a parent in your place of work, particularly if you then also don't feel safe in that place of work, is that little bit of a tipping edge where you've got to decide what environments you're putting yourself in, and how much you are doing that and how much that's safe, because you do have control over that. That's something you can control. Yeah, it's hard. I personally would be inclined to go put myself on a waiting list on the theory that you'll probably be on it that long that it'll be out of your school before you get the chocolate. But there is no harm in having an ND affirming and positive household, because home should be a safe space, even if other places aren't.
Thank you, Nick. This is an anonymous question from somebody who unfortunately had to leave before this point, so hopefully they'll be able to pick this up when they maybe review the recording in a couple of weeks' time. They said, when I first worked with autistic people many years ago, there were schools and services just for autistic people, but these were shut as it was felt that they were better off being integrated into general services. Do you feel that we should return to a model of having autism-specific services in schools? Although I do know that there's a big rise in autism-specific schools, the new free school programme, etc.
The thing is, when we think about, so if I think about what young autistic people tell me about safe spaces, it is very, very rarely a physical space. It is very, very rarely a building. It is always a person within that space. It is a person who, you know, makes them feel understood, that, you know, listens to them, that they can co-regulate from. I was delivering training on Zoom in China a few months back, and they are in a very, very different place to the UK in terms of autism. And they were talking to me that they are just starting this idea of inclusion, what we would view as inclusion, in that, you know, autistic people should be in a mainstream school environment and not put off into sort of like separate schools, because that is currently what they do. They get a diagnosis, they go somewhere else. And they were like, do you think that's a good idea? And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure it's worked out here, but I'm not really sure the other model works either. I think in an ideal world, what I would like to see is everybody have enough level of understanding and of education to be the safe people and be the safe space. And we would need a huge amount more flexibility in our system, because ironically we're meant to be the rigid ones, right? But like, have we looked at the school system recently? You know, and the rigidity in that system, which doesn't lead to sort of monotropism, and it doesn't lead to like self-directed learning, and it definitely doesn't lead to sensory safety, and it doesn't lend well into masking and bullying and other forms of invalidation and exclusion. If I had a magic wand, right? If I had a magic wand, what I would buy is a huge piece of land that had a forest school on one side, a circus school on the other, and a series of small buildings where children could do self-directed and interest-led learning, and we got adults in that were experts in those areas. So there we go. That's Nic's like magic wand solution if we're getting into like magic wand territory. I don't think either work. I think there are lots and lots of autism specific schools, and they are very mixed, incredibly mixed. There are some that I definitely wouldn't send my children to, and there are some that I would. So I don't think as a concept it's the solution. It's about people. It's about people being educated enough to be the safe people.
Thank you, Nic. Lots of love for your magic wand school there. I have a lot of people signing up for that.
Yeah.
Question here about the NeuroBears program itself and how you developed it. So could you tell us a bit more about where it came from and how you went about deciding what would be helpful to include in the program?
Okay, so let's go back to lockdown in 2020. Yeah, I started to deliver the Inside of Autism with Kieran Rose in 2020, and telling children that they're autistic and getting them to understand it has been something that's been very like fundamental in my life. I think it's because I talk about my neurodivergent privilege, so I have a long line of very quite obviously and stereotyped neurodivergent people going back several generations, and the last 3 generations of them lived what we would call sort of like an authentic neurodivergent led, you know, how we would conceive like good autistic life. So I had the privilege of them doing that work before me. So I had that in me, and we started to deliver the Inside of Autism and to thousands of people in the end. And it was constantly, we need a young version of this course, we need a child version of this course, we need that. And I'm like, that's really easy to say. And literally one morning, and I do mean this literally, I think this answer actually annoys people. I woke up and I was like, I can do it with bears. And my husband and my child and Kieran all thought I had gone crazy. But actually within probably 48 hours, roughly what is NeuroBears as you see it today was formed in a notebook, give or take. I had a very, very good idea of what to tell them and what I wanted to say to them, and what I actually needed was a vehicle. And at one point we do literally use sensory cars, like a vehicle to explain it in visuals and in metaphors that kids would grasp and understand. And it's a panda because one, I've always liked pandas, so I had a panda head lying around my house. I don't know where he is. No, he's around the corner. And the lovely Kieran Rose is definitely demand avoidant, and I am not demanding. That's how that works, by the way, for clarity. And one week he was avoiding my demands, and he sent me a gif of a panda doing this, like that, because, you know, autistic communication. And I showed up to the meeting that week wearing the panda head. And then it became a thing. It became a full thing. It became a way that we communicated. He went and bought a panda head. We started showing up to meetings in panda heads. It was crazy. But it became a sort of a symbol of like creating safe spaces. So it was always going to be a panda, other than the fact that pandas bring me joy. But yeah, I did literally just wake up one morning and I was like, I can do it with bears. And it came from there. And realistically, from that day, roughly, it is roughly what it was then. The process was a bit different. The process was a lot of writing and a lot of drafts, and then we sent the first sort of like concept to it to a group of about 25, 30 kids that we called were critical panda friends. And they reviewed like the first draft of it, and then it got changed a little bit, not hugely, but like there was a couple of concepts that were sort of like tweaked and made simpler. That was that. That was it. Did I make that sound
And
easier?
you do, and I'm sure it's not. Are you able to say a little bit about its current evaluation, or?
It's good.
Or just that it's currently going through an academic evaluation program, and watch this space. Yeah, should we say that much?
So like, yeah, the first two phases. Maybe we can talk about what we did. We can talk about what we did. That's public information, right? Okay. So, we asked quite a large group of people. I think we recruited 140. Oh, we recruited more than 140, but 140 did a pre-Neurobears questionnaire where we asked them lots of things. We asked them lots and lots of things about being autistic. We asked the parents, and more importantly, we asked the kids. I'm currently not even doing anything with the parent data. They were lovely though. We liked them. So we asked the kids, and then they got access to Neurobears for 6 weeks. And then we asked them the questions again to see if there was any significant findings after doing Neurobears. And there were lots and lots of significant findings. And having now written some of the papers that have come from that data, what I actually sort of didn't realize is how much we haven't asked the kids. Like we have, like I have a bit of data that's really, really important, and I was like, oh, I'll go find something to cite against that. Nobody's asked. Nobody's asked, and I'm sitting there going, why has nobody asked? So lots and lots of beautiful, beautiful data from beautiful child voice that is stunning and heartbreaking in equal measure. Particularly, I think, because it's written in small person, is coming. But generally, the joke title of the first paper is Neurobears is awesome. So it's good.
And maybe once that's out in the world, it would be really lovely to have you back, Nic, to talk about that evaluation and to share some of that data with us. I'm sure there are people here tonight who'd be really keen to hear that, myself included. So just a question about the Neurobears program, just the actual delivery of it, just because we're talking about that. Sorry, I've just lost it. How do you? Sorry, I will find it.
Can I just assume the question, because I reckon I know what it is?
Yeah, it's kind of how do you get it up and running?
How do you do it?
I've lost the question, but it was something about, this is great. So, how do we make it happen? How do we get it in schools? That was it. How do you also run it? This is it. Could young people access the course alongside other young people in their school as a way to build community together that is, I'm assuming this is from an anonymous person, but I'm assuming that so that there can be a community that's close in geography as well as close in identity. And would you recommend that? And, how would you get it supported by the school and that kind of thing? Okay,
so Neurobears is sold in 2 models. So there is a family account, okay, which it's not vastly different. Which is on my website. It's £55. If you have a child, you are their parent. you want it for your family, that's it. You can just go buy it. It's 12 pre-recorded videos and 90 pages of workbooks, and the second that you have a login for my website, it is just there. Because one of the feedbacks that we got from those first Critical Panda friends is they wanted it to look like YouTube. So I actually literally went and designed my own website for like education hosting, which looks like YouTube. So like families, it's there, you get lifetime access because I didn't want to put a time limit on it. There is another way to experience Neurobears. So we have what's called an organisation or a licensed account. It's also sold internationally. And they run in different ways because there are lots and lots of different organisations that use it in different ways. But as a core, there are practitioners that use it one-to-one with a child. So they take a child through Neurobears, either in person or even online, and they do that together and they share that space and they have those conversations, and they talk about the themes. There are charities and schools that run it in that model that they were talking about. So they run it with a group of young people. And normally they do that over like a number of weeks. It is 12 videos, they're not more than 10 minutes long. But I find a bit of space and a bit of time is really beneficial for like the young people. And then there are organisations and charities, and it is mainly charities that run it in this latter model, unless they're in America, and then it's organisation anyway, that run it as like a family event. So what they do is they get like a group of sort of like 5-6 families together, and they all sit and do it like together as a family, and they watch the videos, and again normally over a number of weeks. I do know people who run it in half days. I do get a bit concerned about them because I think it's all a bit much at once and there should be space and time to reflect. So yeah, and it's all pre-recorded. The books are all there. I'm not saying I'm a control freak, but I am. And like, I was never gonna like let people share a slides and talk over it. It wasn't happening. So yeah, it's all there and it's all incredibly easy to deliver. Literally, you just have to be the safe person in the room. And if you buy a licensed account, you get extra videos. So there's a trainer video type thing in the licensed account. It's called How to Be a Neurobears Ally. So that's there with just sort of like hints and tips about what your room should look like, about like how you could behave and how you could like be a reflective practitioner. There is also a list of stuff that I do not want you to say, like everyone feels like that. No. So like sort of like stuff around that's all in there as well. And in the licensed accounts there is an additional half-an-hour video that's aimed at like siblings or like larger groups of other children, because there's a lot of UK schools with licenses.
Excellent, thank you very much. Thank you. So how are you feeling in terms of questions? Can I post a few more to you?
Of course you can.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a question here from an educational psychologist who's asking for tips for linking autistic children with other autistic young people with other autistic young people, and maybe outside of their own school. They'd like to do that, but they could be doing with some ideas about how schools can do this better across the authority that they work in. But they also want you to know that this was a brilliant talk, and thank you very much.
Thanks. So I think like some local areas have a very clear, this group is for autistic people, be that some sort of, I mean, if I think about up here, right, so I'm in the northeast of England, I can think of an autism specific youth group within 20 minutes of my house. I can think of an autism specific Lego group. I can think of a autism specific like trampolining session, farm session, and they're the sort of we are the autism space kind of thing, and there's loads of them, and there is loads of them. But then also there are loads of like non-declared safe spaces. So like if I think about circus, so like my kids go to circus, they practically live there. That is a naturally ND friendly space just because all the mentors are neurodivergent, because neurotypicals don't juggle chainsaws. And like if I think about forest school, so like there's a forest school not far from my door, the majority of their practitioners are also neurodivergent because they are just burnt out teachers who didn't fit the school system either and then decided to go to the woods. There's a group called Curious Arts, and that is a creative and LGBTQ plus environment. And again, it's not declared an autism space, but because the mentors happen to be mainly neurodivergent and the kids there happen to be mainly neurodivergent, and those intersectionalities just sort of happen and spaces happen. People create their own safe space that then becomes a safe space for other people. And I can guarantee you they will be out there. You just need to go find the equivalent parent in your area of me. And they will tell you where they are.
And we've just had a shout out for Spectrum Gaming there in the chat, which, yeah, I just want to wholeheartedly.
Manchester.
Although you can commission them through local, if there's the money, which is obviously the $1 million, literally, perhaps $1 million question. Yeah. Really simple admin question. Please, could we have a list of the references in your slides so that we can send them out? I'd be happy if you just copy and paste them to me, and then we can send it out in the email that we send to everyone with the link to the video, if you wouldn't mind, Nick, because people would like to read. They'd like to read up on those papers that you've cited, if that's okay.
Yes.
So we have a question here about someone saying, my son, who's 12, is autistic and has just had a diagnosis of ADHD as well. He's always struggled with his autistic identity, and this has worsened with his latest diagnosis. We're very careful not to use a deficit model of language, but to be blunt, he hates himself and he hates being autistic. He wishes he'd never been born autistic. He so desperately wants to be normal, in inverted commas, which are his words. He wishes he was dead. Where do we start with getting support for him and to help him accept himself and the wonderful person he is? And I'm really, really sorry to hear that your son is feeling that way. It must be really hard for you.
Is he embracing his ADHD identity? Was that in there?
It doesn't say.
Doesn't say. Okay. Because obviously we can embrace what ADHD diagnosis if like we're not feeling the autism one at the time. It's hard. So like if we're back to Nick having magic wands, right? I would like all young people to be diagnosed well under puberty, and to sit and watch Neurobears, because I think there is absolutely a point, during that time of puberty where you're just rejecting what everyone tells you, aren't you? It's developmentally normal. Adults are wrong, and that's fine. And then if you mix that in, so I'm quite aware that within mainstream schools there is a bit of a habit of sort of the word autism being used as like a slur, and like something that people might use to bully people with, and that they might be hearing all sorts of negative language and be internalizing that. And how hard is it to fight against that narrative and that environment if that's where they are 5 days a week for 36 hours a week? Can we think about other spaces that might be, neurodivergent friendly? Can we think about circus school? Can we think about forest school? Can we think about surf school? Can we think about places where those neurodivergent adults are and those sort of like neurodivergent kids are, but it's almost like it's unspoken because it doesn't need to be? are those good places to be thinking about? So we're moving away from potentially negative experiences of hearing things maybe in a school or in environments where that negative lens might be happening, and going into spaces where there are neurodivergent adults who are adulting. I'm supposedly adulting, but you know, that are doing all right, that they might look up to, that they might see something positive in and think, actually, maybe I could be like them. Because people want to, you know, we talk about that in all sorts of intersectionalities, that first time that we saw somebody that we identify with, you know, the first time we saw somebody on TV that like looks like us, because there's that as well, that feeds into that, isn't it? That what does autism look like in mainstream media? What does it look like on the telly? What are we feeding young people in there as well? You know, it doesn't look like something you might want to be, something you might want to grow into necessarily. And if they haven't got those sort of that model in their life, I can see why they would want to reject that. But it's difficult to reject something that is fundamentally you, isn't it, without rejecting yourself as a whole. And I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Spaces with nice ND adults. That's where I would start.
Thanks, Nic. Another anonymous question here from someone who says, "Hi Nic, I love your approach. My son is in burnout recovery and he's out of school at the moment. He understands his identity, but he's now so frustrated and upset that his school didn't. He doesn't know any other autistic peers or adults. Any suggestions on how to move forward? He's not accessing anything online at the moment." I wonder if maybe those spaces again that you're talking about. That's the theme in your responses here, I think.
And obviously he doesn't have to go out the house and go to school, because if that's not happening, that's not happening. It's illegal to deregister in England, that's all I'm saying. Like, you can do that. Maybe. You know, it's an option. But yeah, what spaces can he be in that feel safe? And we can validate his trauma. You know, like, I think we're very, very quick to be like, oh, you know, that happens to everyone. Or, I mean, everyone thinks everyone just gets on in school, don't they? That's the myth, right? It's not true. You couldn't pay me any amount of money to go back to secondary school. No amount of money. Literally none. Even knowing what I know now, I would not go back there. And I didn't attend full time when I was there. But yes. And I think, you know, it's different now, isn't it? Because we're talking about fines and we're talking about prosecution, and oh my God, they're doubling down on it. And it leaves you with very limited options as a parent about what you can do about that, particularly if your child has been suffering in that environment. But the suffering's often valid. But yeah, again, it's finding the safe spaces and the safe people. But maybe there's room to sort of like validate and understand the burnout as well, and that sometimes it's part of the process, and it's not about getting back to how you were or the point A you came from, because obviously that didn't work, otherwise you wouldn't have hit such a significant burnout. It's about finding that new point that works for you and works for your family and works for your young person. We're not trying to get back to the bad bit. We're not trying to get back to normal, whatever that is. We're trying to find new ways and new spaces that doesn't lean into that and bad things happening.
Yeah. Thank you. Question here about that the line that kind of separates when it's appropriate to go. I mean, well, first of all, so someone here, I'm going to ask my own question on top of this, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Somebody here is asking, for a 16-year-old mature young person, would the inside of autism be appropriate, or would neurobears be better? So that's the question from the member of the audience tonight. But my question that might come before or after that is, are they a kind of, do you see them as being partner programs? Are they that similar that I know that the Panda neurobears is kind of come from the work that you did on the inside of autism with Kieran, but do they kind of marry up in that way? Is neurobears a kind of a younger version of
I'm gonna completely autism? Regret saying this because you're recording it and then you're gonna send it out. I'm gonna say it anyway. Okay, so I think neurobears as it stands, as long as you can be forgiving that some aspects of it might be perceived as a bit childish, because it's the starting age is 8. Okay, like I'm not hiding away from that, but that doesn't mean it's not a good starting point. It's not going to set you up on the right algorithms. It's not going to, like, you know, you're not going to go find that awful Autism Speaks video by Googling the stuff that I'm telling you. Okay, so it's not an immediate lead on. I think the inside of autism is 18 plus, and I think it should be 18 plus. We have had slightly younger people attend with their parents, but we no longer run it live. So I would, and you can ask Kieran, I'm not here to speak for him, but like I would suggest it's 18 plus. So I have a solution to this. Neurobears Cups is coming, and it will be coming this year. I've literally sat and went through the animation of it this morning. So that's almost made. Now bear in mind I started writing that last year. So that's for under 8s. All of Tuesday I was sat on Kieran's kitchen table writing whatever Neurobears Plus looks like, which will bridge that gap between this being a bit young for older teenagers and something that's a lot higher level of information and understanding. However, I am very serious about that probably being 2025. Very serious about that. So because these things don't happen, well, often when I start they happen quickly, but what's important is to make sure they are safe, because as a professional, as a practitioner, the last thing I want to do is harm. And when I was sitting making a skeleton of what that in-between course would look like, I literally put my head in my hands and said, why am I doing this? Because they need to be very, very different conversations. And those more difficult conversations are more difficult to make safe. Particularly if you are not holding that room, if it is a pre-recorded situation like Neurobears is. There has to be even more care there. And then when you sell it internationally, it's much harder to signpost to agencies of safety. It's very easy to do, like, you know, if you pick an area, there's a list. But when you sell internationally, that gets even more complicated. My God, that was a long answer, wasn't it? Essentially, Neurobears is fine, but I'm aware there's a gap. And I'm attempting to sort that.
Very excited about the Cubs and the Neurobears Plus, and you've got a whole load of people here who want to come and work for you now as well. So if you need a workforce, you've got some candidates here.
That is a genuine thing. So I've now made a skeleton of what that looks like, and because I do a lot of perfection as a practitioner, there are areas where I think I need collaboration. So if you have any genius ideas or anything that you desperately want to share and communicate with older young people, drop us an email and we can have a chat.
Thank you, Nic. There's your instructions, folks. Well, we're about to wrap up for the evening, and I always end our talks by asking our speaker the same question, and that is, if there was just one thing that you wanted us all to go away with this evening from all the lots and lots of amazing things you've told us tonight, what would that one thing be?
Why aren't we asking the kids? They can tell us. They have the information. We just need to start asking them.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everyone who's joined us this evening. I'm really sorry if I didn't get round to your question. I know there were a couple of questions that were still outstanding. I apologise for that, but we have run out of time for this evening.